Hi, in this video, I wanted to go through some basics about Massachusetts administrative law. So some of the things I want to cover are, I want to talk a little bit about the Massachusetts Administrative Procedure Act, and then I want to talk about the power that the agencies have. So the executive agencies or administrative agencies at both the federal and the state level, although we're talking about Massachusetts here, the power that they have is a power that's been delegated by the legislature. So for all the agencies, you'll see some form of enabling legislation giving them that delegated power. The powers that the agencies have are very similar to all three branches of government. So they're like a legislature in that they can promulgate rules and regulations that have the force of law. They're like the courts, or at least some of them are, because they can issue administrative decisions and adjudications between parties. And they're like the executive branch in that they can conduct investigations and prosecute individuals for violations of those rules and statutes within their purview. Okay, so that's just some real basic information about what administrative agencies are like. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Administrative Procedure Act in Massachusetts. So if you've worked with federal administrative agencies before, you're probably familiar with the federal APA. But basically, this is the statute, so the law passed by the legislature that governs how the agencies can promulgate rules, and also it governs how they can adjudicate decisions. One thing I want to keep in mind is it doesn't cover every single agency in Massachusetts. In fact, I've given you the beginning of the definition section. This whole chapter has to do with the administrative procedures of the executive agencies. But this definition section, if you look at it, there's a definition for what actually is an agency. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about that enabling act I mentioned, and I gave you just one example here. So the power that the agency gets is always from the legislature. So you're going to want to look, if you're dealing with an administrative agency, for the statutes that give the agency the power. And a lot of times they're a lot longer than this, and this one actually had a few more sections that would probably be on point, but I just wanted to show you the example for the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health and how this statutory section is giving the power to the agency to promulgate the rules and regulations that they need to do the job that has been given to them by the legislature. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how you could find the statutory authority that the agencies have. And there's a couple of different ways, but in Massachusetts, a lot of times when you're looking at the section of the regulation itself, there'll be a little section that talks about the regulatory authority of whatever department you're looking at. This one is the Department of Mental Health, and you can see 104 CMR 25.01. That's a regulatory section, so that's part of the Mass Regs. And it's telling us that the department is authorized under certain sections of the Massachusetts statutes to adopt, amend, and repeal regulations because it needs to do that to carry out its responsibilities. Okay, and often you'll see this within the regulations themselves. I want to talk a little bit about why you might be looking for regulations. So one clue that you might need to look for regulations is that the area of law is highly technical. So a good example of this is environmental or tax law, when there's just so much on point that the legislature can't look at all the details. That's a sign to you that there's probably regulations that could be involved in your legal issue. When you're looking at a statute and the regulations are mentioned in the annotations to the statute or in citing results, so results that are in the citator, obviously if that statute's on point, you're going to want to look at those regs as well to see if they're on point for your case. If you're looking at secondary source authority and in addition to cases and statutes, regulations are mentioned as being on point, you're going to want to go read the regulations. Obviously, if you found cases that are citing to regulations, just like you would go read the underlying statute, you need to read the regulations as well. And then I just wanted to give you a heads up as to areas that are often regulated, and these are just a couple, there's obviously others. So let's talk a little bit about the sources of law for regulations in Massachusetts. So I've given you the two main ones here, and the first one, the Code of Massachusetts Regulations, that's where you're going to be doing most of your research. That's the current regulations arranged by subject, and I've just given you some ideas of where you can find the Code of Mass Regulations. The second one is the Massachusetts Register, and it was mentioned in your reading. It's a bi-weekly publication, and it includes things like executive orders, regulations, notices of when there's going to be public hearings for proposed regulations, and also importantly, emergency regulations that go into immediate effect will be found here and not in the Code of Massachusetts Regulations. And then again, I've given you some sources that you could go to find the Mass Register. All right, I wanted to give you one other little hint, which is mentioned in the reading. The Code of Massachusetts Regulations is organized by subject, but it's also organized by department. So if you want to know if a particular agency has regs on point, if you look through the table of contents for the Massachusetts regulations, you can see the different agencies listed by title. And then if you were to click into this happens to be on Westlaw, but you could do the same on Lexis, you could see the regulations that were promulgated by the particular agencies. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you would update. Say you do find a section of the Code of Mass Regulations that's on point. How do you know that it's current? So the first thing you want to do is check the currency of your source. So if it was something that said it was current through January 3rd, for example, then you'd know that the time frame that you need to look for is between January 3rd and today to see if there's anything new that had happened. And we'll go through this when we look at the sources online. You want to check for emergency regulations, and as I mentioned, those would only be in the Massachusetts Register. A couple of other points on KeyCite. You will see some citing references, but there's not going to be any flags, and there's not going to be any flags for anything new in the Massachusetts Register. So you're just getting some key citing results for cases or administrative decisions that have referenced or talked about that particular section of the CMR. For shepherds, there's no coverage right now for state regulations, same for KeyCite. I did want to mention that you can search case law or the Massachusetts Register by using the citation, and we'll go over that when we look at some of the online sources. So you're creating your own citator, basically. So that was a little bit about regulations, and I wanted to talk briefly about agency decisions. So why would you want to look for agency decisions? Well, if you had a case before a particular agency, it would help you understand how in the past an agency has decided maybe on a similar issue. So for most agencies, there are a few at the federal level that it works differently, but for most agencies, the decisions don't have precedential value, but it can give you a good idea of how, by looking at how something's decided in the past, what you might be able to expect for your outcome. Okay, and so where are you going to find those agency decisions? The first place that I'm going to recommend is to check the exhibit in Exhibit 6A in the Handbook of Legal Research that followed the reading that was assigned. There's select coverage on some of the subscription databases, the commercial publishers that we've been using, and those will be mentioned in that exhibit. And then another really good place to look, this works great for a lot of the federal agencies and sort of okay for some of the state agencies, is to check the agency website to see if there are any agency decisions. I'm talking about online access here. The other thing that was mentioned in the reading is that you can go to the agency itself and ask for the agency decisions if you needed to in print. Okay. I just gave you, and I will post this as well. I wanted to give you just some other places that I thought would be helpful to get agency information. In Massachusetts, there's a really nice diagram of the Massachusetts agencies. There's a list that is available on the MassGov site that lists all the state offices and also some of the courts. I had this list of quasi-public authorities that I thought might be helpful for you. And then the final one is the regulations manual mentioned in the reading. And this is good if you're doing lots of work before one of the administrative agencies in Massachusetts and you really want to understand how the process that the regulations have to go through from an agency perspective, which gives you sort of a timeline of the steps. This is a really good source for you to take a quick look at. Not necessarily today for this class, but to keep in mind if you end up doing lots of mass administrative agency work at your job. Okay, so that's just it for some basic info. In the next videos will be some tips online.